On the morning I offered to help with the wedding, my son looked me dead in the eye and said, "We've decided you're not part of the inner circle." Not rude, just cold. Like a hotel receptionist turning away a guest without a reservation. I stood there in his hallway, holding a small bag of pastries I brought over, the ones his mother used to bake before she passed. He didn't even glance at them. I should have left then. But I nodded, said, "All right," and walked out like a guest, overstaying his welcome. I didn't ask what inner circle meant. I didn't need to. A week later, the envelope came. No return address, just my full name, printed stiffly in large block font. No dad, no to the man who raised me. Inside, an invitation to the wedding. Generic, formal, no note, no handwriting, not even a signature. It felt like getting a bank statement, like I was being informed of an event, not invited to it. The wedding would be held at an estate I recognized. Not because I'd ever been there, but because I helped pay for the very type of places my son now thought he belonged in. When he was 10, I used to drive him past places like this and say, "One day if you work hard." Funny, I guess he worked hard, hard enough to forget. I flipped the invitation over, hoping for a postscript, a small note. Nothing. Not even a handwritten time, just printed perfection. I stared at the date, June 17th. His mother and I were married on June 17th, 31 years ago. He used to love that story. Maybe he forgot. Or maybe he didn't care. I called to ask a small question about attire. His fiancée picked up. When I asked if it would be formal or semi-formal, she sighed. "As long as it's not old-looking," she said. Then a pause. And nothing that draws attention. I swallowed my pride again. Of course. When I hung up, I placed the envelope on the table, next to a framed photo of his mother holding him as a baby. I sat down, and for the first time in years, I felt like a guest in my own bloodline. But I didn't tear the invitation up. No. I placed it gently into the drawer beside my old checkbook, the same one I once used to pay for his first bicycle, his first semester, his first mistake. Little did he know. That same checkbook would pay for the very venue where he'd try to erase me. And I wouldn't stop it. Because some lessons don't come with lectures. They come with silence and receipts. Friends, let me pause for just a moment. Please take a second to write in the comments. Where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something like this in your own life? If this story speaks to you, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone. It's a small action, but it truly helps us grow this channel and bring more stories to light. Now, let's continue. I waited 3 days before calling again, not to press, not to intrude, just to ask a simple question. Should I wear a suit or a tuxedo? It wasn't about style, it wasn't vanity. It was about wanting to fit in, wanting just this once to not be the odd shape in a perfect frame. They had money now. Her family did. They had that polished kind of confidence that comes not from character, but from generations of being told they're the right kind. I knew I wasn't that. So I asked the question carefully, almost as a whisper. Her voice answered before his, not sharp. Worse, indifferent. As long as it's not embarrassing. The word cut deeper than anything else she could have said. Not because it was cruel, but because it was casual. Like I was a possibility they were managing, a risk they were calculating. And the silence that followed was worse. Because he was there. I could hear him in the background. He didn't laugh, didn't defend me. He just let it hang. That's when I realized this wasn't about clothing. It was about erasure. They weren't dressing me, they were dressing me down, quietly, deliberately. I looked over at my old Navy suit, worn but clean, pressed the night before. That suit had seen job interviews I wasn't supposed to get, but did. It had been there the day I signed over my bonus to pay for his first car. It had held his mother's trembling hand the day she got her diagnosis. But to them, it was just embarrassing. I didn't argue, didn't ask what would count as safe. Instead, I hung the phone up slowly, walked to the wardrobe, and unzipped the protective bag of the one tuxedo I owned, the one we bought together for his high school prom when he couldn't afford to rent his own. He had once said I looked like James Bond in it. Now I wondered if he remembered saying that, or if that version of me had been left in some emotional attic, gathering dust. I sat down at the edge of my bed and stared at the shoes beside it. The same ones I polished the night before his wedding proposal, when he asked me to walk him through the right words. I helped him craft a speech filled with dignity and promise. Now all I had was a dress code and a warning. Something cracked quietly inside me. Not loud enough to echo. Just enough to shift the way a foundation does after years of quiet storms. I smiled anyway. That's what fathers do. They wear the quiet and carry the weight, even when they're told to make themselves smaller. The rehearsal dinner was held at a place I recognized immediately, not because I had ever eaten there, but because I had driven past it years ago with my son in the passenger seat. He was still in college then. We'd just left his part-time job interview, and I remember him pressing his forehead to the car window, pointing at the restaurant, glowing softly behind its manicured hedges and golden light. "Imagine eating there," he had whispered. "That's where real people go." Real people. People who made it. People who were seen. Back then we couldn't even afford the valet. And now? Now I was walking through its doors, alone, wearing the tuxedo that no longer felt like armor. I wasn't met with warmth or recognition, just a staff member, checking my name against a guest list, then motioning toward the far end of the hall. The room was filled with laughter. Her family had arrived early. They were loud in the way that people are when they know the room belongs to them. There was confidence in their movements, their conversations layered with names of universities, vineyard owners, and vacation properties. No one asked who I was. No one needed to. I was the one sitting alone, off to the side as though I had accidentally wandered into the celebration of strangers. The head table gleamed at the center. Ornate place cards, hand-picked wine glasses, flowers arranged not for scent, but for statement. My son sat beside his bride-to-be, a glass of something golden in his hand. He was smiling. The kind of smile I hadn't seen since before he started worrying about how the world saw him. But that smile wasn't for me. It belonged to them now. When he stood to speak, I leaned in, hoping for something. A word, a glance, a nod in my direction, a thread of connection I could hold on to. But he spoke of the journey he and his fiancée had taken, how grateful he was for her family's support, how this night was a testament to building something new. New, without acknowledgement of what came before, and still, when the server poured my glass, I stood, quietly. I raised it, hoping perhaps the gesture might reach him, that the boy who once clutched my hand in school hallways would remember, even if only for a second, the man who walked every mile beside him. He didn't meet my eyes. He turned his head, just slightly, and lifted his own glass to someone across the table. My toast hung in the air unspoken. It wasn't just a skipped moment. It was a refusal. And still, I swallowed my wine. I watched as her father made a toast that made the room erupt in laughter. I watched as they leaned in to share family jokes I didn't understand, as they welcomed my son like he had been carved from their bloodline. I listened to strangers call him one of us, as if everything before them had been a dress rehearsal. I sat in the corner, not the head, not the heart, just a shape in a room full of declarations, forgotten histories, and polished futures. The waiter came by and gently placed the check in front of me. I didn't flinch. Of course they'd assumed I'd covered the dinner. And I did. Silently, without fanfare, without permission. Because sometimes dignity means paying the bill even when no one remembers you ate. I left before dessert. No one noticed. It was during cocktail hour, just before the wedding day, when it happened. One of her cousins, tall, tan, confident in the way only people who've never had to ask twice feel confident, leaned in toward my son, drink in hand, and laughed as he said it. "She's definitely marrying up." The words weren't sharp, they were tossed out like a casual compliment, the kind meant to flatter the bride, but they hung in the air with a weight I couldn't ignore. I was standing close enough to hear it, close enough that the echo of those 3 words landed directly on me, like a drink spilled deliberately in my lap. I didn't react, not outwardly. My hands stayed still, folded over my glass. But inside, something sank, something heavy and old, like bricks in water. The cousin was looking at me when he said it. There was no doubt who he meant, and what haunted me wasn't the joke. It was the moment after. My son didn't laugh. That would have been easier, maybe. He didn't look embarrassed either. He didn't correct him. He just gave a small, crooked smile. Not cruel, but aligned. Aligned with them. A smirk of agreement, of silent compliance. As if to say, let it slide, it's not wrong. And in that second I saw it all. I saw the way he stood taller around them, the way he leaned into their rhythm, the way he adopted their ease with exclusion, a kind of effortless trimming of the inconvenient parts of the story, parts like me. He had taken pieces of his past, the sacrifices, the long nights I drove an extra shift so he could focus on finals, the holes in my shoes I never replaced so he could walk into interviews without shame, and folded them away like a shirt that no longer fit the man he was trying to be. He wasn't ashamed of where he came from. That would have implied conflict. No, it was something colder. He simply saw no need to include it anymore, to include me. It's a different kind of betrayal when it comes without anger. It's cleaner, quieter. It doesn't burn. It fades. Later that evening, I excused myself from the lounge where the laughter was too loud and the wine too sweet. I walked outside into the cool air, away from the polished lights and the curated conversations. I sat on a bench that overlooked the hills, the same hills I once pointed to in storybooks, telling a little boy that one day he could go anywhere. I just never realized that anywhere might mean leaving me behind. A part of me wanted to confront him, to ask if he heard what was said, if he understood what silence cost. But I didn't, because he had already answered. Not with words, but with that smirk. And in that quiet moment beneath the dimming sky, I finally stopped asking why I felt like a stranger, because it was clear. He wasn't ashamed of me. He just didn't see me in the picture anymore. And that, more than anything, is how a heart cracks. Not through hate, but through quiet exclusion, dressed in suits and sealed with smiles. I didn't wait for dessert that night. I slipped out quietly, unnoticed again. Just like at the dinner, just like at the speech, just like in his life lately. The valet looked surprised when I handed him my own keys. He offered to fetch the car, but I shook my head. No need, I'll walk. It was late. The air had that familiar evening chill, the kind that wraps itself around your bones if you're carrying more than just weather. The streets were nearly empty. Lights from the reception hall spilled out behind me, warm and golden. A glow I used to believe meant something. Now it felt like the edge of a stage I was no longer allowed to stand on. I walked slowly, not because I was tired, but because walking was all I had left that still felt like mine. There was no one to call. I could have reached out to an old friend, maybe even my sister. But what would I say? That my son, the boy I once held during thunderstorms, the teenager I coached through heartbreak, the man I quietly supported as he built his new world, had decided I wasn't enough for the one he was marrying into? No, some things aren't meant to be shared. Some heartbreaks don't sound as heavy when you put them into words. They have to be carried, quietly, like a folded letter you never send. As I walked, my feet found their own rhythm. Familiar streets, familiar corners. I passed the diner we used to stop at after Saturday soccer games, the one where he'd insist on pancakes even if it was 5 p.m. I remembered the way his cleats dangled over the booth seat, too short to reach the floor, and how he'd talk with syrup on his chin, believing every story he told was the most important thing in the world. I never corrected him, because to me, it was. I passed the old shoe repair shop I used to go to when the soles of my work boots started to fray. I never replaced them outright. Not when tuition bills were coming. Not when he needed a new laptop. Glue and leather patches were cheaper than pride. I remembered the nights I'd come home from double shifts, feet blistered, hands raw, and yet I'd tiptoe into his room just to watch him sleep, just to remind myself what it was all for. And somewhere along that walk, I realized something both devastating and freeing. All the dreams I had, all the places I could have gone, the chances I didn't take, the comforts I let pass, I didn't lose them. I gave them to him willingly, without regret. But I had never imagined that one day he would look back at all I gave and see it as less. I reached my home and unlocked the door. The house was quiet. No one waited for me, but the silence wasn't empty. It was full of every unspoken memory, every small act of love I thought would echo forever. I sat down at the kitchen table. The invitation still sat in the drawer. The suit still hung pressed and waiting. And next to it, the checkbook, still untouched. But not for long. Because I knew then what I hadn't admitted before. He didn't just want me quiet. He wanted me invisible. But what he didn't understand was that the foundation of a house never asks to be seen. It simply holds everything up, even when no one says thank you. I ran my finger across the old wood of the table. This table had held birthdays, school projects, spilled orange juice, and tears. It had held us, and now it held the truth. I didn't need an invitation to be his father, and I didn't need applause to love him, but he had made his choice, and soon I would make mine. I woke before dawn, the house still wrapped in dreams, and carried my suit upstairs like a fragile heirloom. It wasn't just fabric and thread, it was every promise I ever made to him. The midnight yellow glow of the lamp illuminated the charcoal wool, the satin lapels that had caught the light at his high school graduation when he stood on that stage and scanned the crowd until his eyes found mine. He'd pointed and grinned, shouting over the applause, "That's my hero!" I pressed a hand over my chest as I lined up the jacket and trousers on the bed. I traced the crease down each pant leg, the precision of a tailor's care, and remembered the day I splurged on its first dry cleaning, putting off bills so I could look sharp for his milestone. In my mind, I heard his voice, "You look unstoppable, Dad." Unstoppable, a word I wore like armor. Now, as I touched the satin pocket trim, my heart clenched. In their world, that suit was a relic, something cheap, something embarrassing. But heroes don't parade for accolades. They don't demand spotlights. They simply show up when it matters most, shoulders squared, heart open. I slipped it on carefully, feeling the weight of every repaired seam and hidden stitch. I could almost feel his childish excitement pulsing through me, the way his laughter once filled this quiet room. Standing in front of the mirror, I saw the man I had been, unfailing, unwavering, unashamed. And beneath that reflection, I realized that no matter what he or anyone else called me, I would still walk through those doors. Because a father's love isn't measured by applause or approval, it's measured by presence. That morning, I didn't need reassurance. I didn't need someone to call me hero. The suit carried our history, and I carried my truth. Ready or not, I would walk into that celebration knowing exactly who I was and what I stood for. I found the coordinator near the entrance, her clipboard glinting beneath the chandelier's light, and asked where I would be seated. She paused, her pen tracing names down the list before she looked up and said, "Back row, left side, behind the photography crew." I thanked her and turned, walking toward the sea of ivory chairs arranged in perfect symmetry. As I slipped into the back row, the hush of expectations settled over me like a familiar cloak. From that vantage point, just behind the cluster of cameras clicking and the lenses swiveling to capture every hopeful glance, I became part of the scenery, an outline in the dimmer light, blending into the background. I watched guests settle into their seats, voices hushed with anticipation, unaware of the stories buried in the shadows. Behind me, the photographers whispered, angles shifting, striving for the perfect shot. In front of me stretched the aisle he would walk, the altar he would stand before, the promises he would vow. And there I sat, the man who had laid every brick in his path now folded discreetly into the edge of the image. Yet even shadows have their place. In that quiet corner, I felt a strange power, an unspoken witness to every expression, every unguarded moment, every flicker of emotion that others would miss. I straightened my jacket, feeling the weight of memory in its fabric, and inhaled the soft scent of gardenias drifting through the aisle. In that shadowed seat, I realized that being unseen didn't diminish my presence. Instead, it granted me clarity. I could observe, remember, and, when the time came, step forward with a quiet truth that no amount of exclusion could ever erase. He caught me just as the florist tucked the final rose into the arch. His voice was low, urgent, almost hesitant. "Dad, I appreciate you being here, but don't do anything to draw attention, okay? This isn't about you." In the soft dawn of that moment, I saw the boy who once clung to my hand the first day of kindergarten, replaced by a man afraid of his own father's shadow. My chest tightened. I remembered holding him after his first heartbreak, whispering that pain fades if you let yourself feel it. I remembered staying awake all night to finish his college application, his future folded into every carefully chosen word. And now he was asking me to shrink myself further, another request for silence on the day he promised forever. I looked at his eyes, dark, resolute, distant. I saw the years of pride he carried in his posture and the weight of new expectations he shouldered. I thought of the sacrifices that built this moment, the extra shifts, the empty pockets, the countless times I brushed imaginary dust off his shoulders so he could stand tall. He didn't see those moments anymore. He only saw what stood beside him. I nodded, voice steady despite the ache. All right, it won't be. There was no bitterness in my words, only a calm acceptance that I would stand where he asked, silent and steadfast. In that pause before the vows, I felt the tremor of something shifting beneath us, a subtle quake in the foundation of what he thought he built alone. As he walked away to take his place, I stayed rooted in that spot, heart open but quiet. I watched him draw a breath and face the gathering of witnesses he trusted more than me. And in that moment I made my own vow, to be present, to remember, and, when the time was right, to tell the truth that living shadows can speak more powerfully than any spotlight ever could. I stood at the edge of the gathering, arms folded loosely at my sides, as her father's voice rose in the warm glow of the chandeliers. He spoke of history, tradition, and the weight of carrying the family legacy, his words rolling out like fine silk. Each thread meant to remind everyone present that this union was about more than two hearts. It was about bloodlines and status. Applause followed like clockwork, polite and predictable, sealing his declaration in a wash of approval. But then came the sotto voce. I heard them ripple through the crowd. The venue? I heard the bride's family paid in full. A murmur that spread like water seeping through cracks. I felt a flutter of satisfaction in the chest I tried so hard to steady. They thought the groom's family had footed the bill. Everyone assumed it. Everyone assumed I had paid. My hand slipped into my pocket. Fingers brushed the check stub tucked inside, still soft and warm from the ink and paper. I closed my fist around it, feeling the weight of every unpaid bill I'd ever swallowed to send him to camp, to college, to wherever he dreamed. That checkbook had been my silent vow, to do whatever it took so he could stand proud in rooms like this. I watched her father lower his glass, face shining with familial pride, utterly unaware that the narrative had shifted. His toast about legacy suddenly took on a new significance. Legacy isn't just inherited. Sometimes it's financed with sweat, sleepless nights, and the quiet insistence of a man who would rather go unnoticed than see his son diminished. In the hush that followed the whispers, I felt the moment stretch, an unbroken thread between past and present. I could step forward, place that check on the head table, and let the truth unfold. But I held back, letting the silence speak its own eloquence. I could almost see the questions flicker across faces. Is he going to? Didn't he? How did this happen? The check was meant to be a gift, nothing more. Not a gesture of power, not a demand for gratitude. But in that moment, it became truth. A reminder that the foundation of this celebration was laid long before the rings were exchanged. And though others might never know what it cost me, I did. I smoothed my hand over the check stub, as if calming a restless child, then slipped it back into my wallet. My heart thumped, equal parts sorrow and pride. I had the power to unravel the illusion, to rewrite the perception, yet I chose to stay in the shadows, carrying my truth quietly like a secret treasure no one else could claim. Because some gifts aren't meant for grand reveals. They're meant to remind the giver of why they gave it all. And for me, that was enough. I drifted toward the soft chatter near the hors d'oeuvre table, pretending to admire the centerpiece as voices rose in hushed tones. That's when I heard it. A cousin's laugh, clipped and dismissive. He means well, but he just doesn't get it. He's not on our level anymore. Those words were like stones, dropped into the glass of my heart, rippling lines of judgment across every memory we'd ever shared. Not our level. As if love were measured in market value, as if devotion had a price tag that could be outgrown. I remembered the nights I tiptoed home after overtime shifts so I could tuck him in before his first spelling bee. The mornings I brewed coffee with trembling hands, balancing visions of college tuition against the balance in my checking account. The Saturdays I wore worn-out boots to drive him to soccer practice in a rusted-out car with a fan taped to the dashboard to keep us both from melting. None of it counted now. It was as if every act of care vanished the moment I took my seat at the back. The room buzzed around me, vows rehearsed to perfection, the choreography of genteel acceptance, but I was a footnote in the script. Someone meant to be seen, but not truly seen. A pang of sorrow cut through me, sharper than any confrontation. Betrayal without confrontation, more insidious. They weren't shouting it at me. They were murmuring it to each other, confident I wouldn't overhear. But I did. I heard every syllable. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight settle. Love with ranks. Sacrifice with an expiration date. The scent of the gardenias seemed suddenly too sweet, cloying. I opened my hand and felt the faint indentation of the check stub in my wallet, a reminder of the silent labor that had built the life he now flaunted. In that stillness, I realized something fierce and freeing. I had not lost my worth because they chose not to acknowledge it. Worth is not determined by applause or inclusion in their circle. It is forged in the choices we make when no one is watching, when we brush off dust so our children can shine, when we give up comforts for their comfort, when we love without bargaining. I straightened in my seat, pulling the suit's lapels into place. If they refused to see me at their level, then I would simply exist on my own terms. Silent, yes, but unbroken, because a man's dignity isn't dictated by exclusive invitations or whispered judgments. It's defined by the grace with which he carries both pride and pain. And in the quiet of that moment, I found a spark of something new, a resolve not to fade into their backdrop, but to stand firm in the dignity I had earned. Love may have ranks to them, but character recognizes no hierarchy. So I sat tall, not for their approval, but for myself. And in that choice I reclaimed every step of the journey that had brought me here. The string quartet began the first notes of Pachelbel's canon, each chord weaving through the hush of gathered faces. Guests rose as one, a wave of dresses and ties, a sea of anticipation. I watched my son's shoulders stiffen, just a fraction, before he straightened his posture, forcing a confident smile. It wasn't the tremor of pre-wedding nerves I saw in his eyes. It was something sharper, the anxiety of a man about to pledge himself to a future that demanded he leave the past, and me, behind. He stood at the threshold, tuxedo crisp, hands clasped at his side, as if bracing himself for an unseen storm. I felt time stretch between us, all the memories cascading in a silent reel. The bedtime stories I read under dim lights, the hand-me-down skates I glued back together so he could learn to glide, the nights I sat outside his dorm window when homesickness sent him racing out into the cold. Every step he'd taken toward his dreams had been guided, gently but firmly, by my own footsteps. Now he stood alone, footlights on that manicured aisle illuminating a path he believed would carry him forward, but forward, away from what had shaped him. The crowd's collective breath held in suspense, waiting for the vows that would bind him to someone new, and to a life that seemed to include everything except the man who built the foundation. His fiancée walked down the aisle, radiant in lace and light, and met his gaze with tears bright as glass. He reached for her hand, and for a heartbeat I saw the warmth return to his eyes. But then he glanced over her shoulder, directly past me, to the faces of friends and family whose embrace he craved more than mine. In that instant, his fear revealed itself. Not fear of love's weight, but fear of the name he carried. He trembled at the thought of carrying mine into this new chapter, a chapter he wanted devoid of the man who filled every blank page of his story until now. My heart constricted, a silent knot of sorrow and understanding. I would not call out. I would not step into that aisle uninvited. Instead, I pressed my palms to my thighs, feeling the fine wool of the suit that carried our shared history. I inhaled the scent of fresh flowers and old memories, and I let the moment settle. A pause between past and future, between legacy and reinvention. And then the officiant spoke. The ceremony launched into motion, and my son, nervous groom, turned fully toward the life he thought he wanted. In his smile I saw hope. In his stance I saw resolve. But beyond that, in the quiet spaces between each note, I heard the echo of what he was leaving behind. As the music swelled, I remained seated, a silent witness to his new beginning. Because sometimes the most powerful declarations aren't spoken at the altar. They're held in the stillness of observation, in the way a man stands when the world expects him to kneel, and in the way a father loves when the son he raised walks a path that forgets the footprints laid for him. I rose before the words could leave the officiant's lips, the hush of the assembled crowd folding around me like a held breath. Every eye turned, 1,000 small spotlights converging on the man who was meant to remain unseen. My heart pulsed, steady and certain. This was never about drama, but about truth. But I stepped forward, each footfall reverberating in the quiet, the polished floor reflecting my silhouette as though offering two versions of the same man, one bound by expectations, the other freed by purpose. Without hesitation, I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and drew out a crisp white envelope, its edges sharp, its promise unspoken. When I handed it to him, my son's hand trembled slightly as he took it. He looked up, confusion and something like guilt momentarily flickering across his face. I spoke, voice calm but carrying through the stillness. This is the check that paid for this venue. Not for attention, not for thanks, just so you'd have the day you dreamed of. There was no shame in my words, only the quiet authority of a father who had built dreams with sweat and sacrifice, who had stood behind the scenes so his son could step into the light. A murmur rippled through the guests, and I felt the weight of their curiosity settle on my shoulders, but I did not flinch. I did not wait for their approval. He opened the envelope, eyes scanning the stub of inked promise, and his breath caught. In that moment, I saw every unacknowledged sacrifice reflected back at me. Late nights in dimly lit offices, worn-out boots patched instead of replaced, college applications mailed with trembling hope, all of it laid bare in that simple gesture. I turned away then, shoulders straight, head held high, and walked down the aisle. No grand exit, just steady steps, back through the arch of flowers and into the open air of my own resolve. The click of my shoes faded behind me, and I felt lighter, as though a burden I never meant for him to bear had finally lifted. As I stepped outside, the evening breeze met me, cool against my skin, carrying the distant glow of lanterns and laughter. And I realized that some moments don't need applause to be profound. Some truths don't need an audience to be heard. I carried the echoes of that room with me, not as a weight, but as a testament. Love isn't measured by proximity or recognition, but by the strength to step forward, gently, to remind someone of what they once forgot. The moment I stepped away, the atmosphere inside shifted, as though a storm had passed through the room. There was no applause, only a hush so heavy it pressed against the walls. I imagined the chandeliers dimming in sympathy, the air thick with questions nobody dared to voice. Behind me I heard the soft scrape of chairs as guests leaned toward each other, whispers unfolding like wings. Did he really? Was that the check? Why didn't he wait? Each murmured syllable carrying its own weight, like stones dropped into a still pond. Inside, her face had gone pale, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the shock in her eyes. She stared at him, the folded envelope trembling in his hand as if her entire world had tilted on its axis in that instant. Her parents were even more still, mouths opening and closing without sound, searching for words strong enough to capture the awkward fracture in their perfect evening. And him? He remained frozen at the altar's edge, shoulders squared as if bracing against an unseen wind. He didn't chase me. He didn't call my name. He didn't even look back. That night, he vanished into the blur of cameras and concerned relatives. But in his heart, I knew. The echo of what I'd done would reverberate far longer than the ceremony itself. Days passed. The world around me carried on. Guests returned to their homes. Social feeds buzzed with photos of the celebration, and toasts were raised in distant cities. Yet I heard nothing from him. Not a text, not a call, not even a social media mention. It was as though I had become a ghost in his new life, present but untouchable. Weeks followed. Every morning I'd check my phone instinctively, hoping for a message that would bridge the silence. "I'm sorry. Can we talk? Thank you. Anything." But the only notifications I received were reminders of my own quiet world. Appointments, bills, reminders to water the plants. In that silence, I felt the weight of my choice and the gravity of his absence. It pressed against me, a testament to the truth I had spoken. Yet beneath the ache, there was also a fierce clarity. Healing begins with honesty, even when it costs us everything we thought would last. And so I carried on, each day walking through rooms filled with memories, listening for the softest invitation to return. Because sometimes the loudest revelations leave behind the quietest spaces, and it is in those spaces that forgiveness must find its own voice. 3 months passed, like a slow turning of seasons, each day folding into the next without a word from him. I had grown accustomed to the quiet, its weight settling around me like dust on old furniture. Then, one ordinary afternoon, I opened the mailbox to find a single cream-colored envelope nestled among the usual bills and flyers. No return address, no flourish on the handwriting, just neat block letters. To Dad. My fingers trembled as I carried it inside, the envelope whispering against my palm. I closed the door, leaned against its warmth, and slid it open. There, on a simple card, the 4 words stabbed into my chest. I was wrong. Beneath them lay a photograph, an image captured in the soft glow of sunset. My son standing at the altar, his face a mixture of shock and recognition, the pale envelope clutched in one hand, the check stub peeking out like a secret revealed. I stared at that picture as if seeing him for the first time in months. In his eyes, I saw the moment he understood what he had taken for granted. The sacrifices stitched into every creased bill, the silent pact of love his father had honored in full. In the margins of the card, in handwriting unmistakably his own, he had scrawled one final line. "You gave me more than a venue. You gave me a spine." The words echoed in the hollow space of my chest, each syllable a note struck on an old, weathered piano. A spine. Not a favor. Not a charity. A spine. Strength he had found not in wealth or status, but in knowing someone had his back, no matter how far he tried to step away. Tears blurred my vision as I sank into the chair by the window, the photograph trembling between my fingers. I saw years of midnight oil burned, of extra shifts swallowed, so he could chase every dream unfettered. I saw the nights I sat in the dark, wondering if my quiet support would ever find its way back to me. And in that moment, I realized it had, stronger than I'd dared hope. Outside, the late summer sun streamed through the glass, warming the edges of that envelope and the photograph it had borne. I placed both on the table, tracing the curve of his jaw in the picture, the fine loop of his handwriting on the card. A quiet smile broke through the years of sorrow and pride, and I whispered a thanks he could never hear. Because some acknowledgments come without fanfare. They come in small, unannounced letters that speak of understanding and redemption. And as I folded the card and set it beside the framed photograph of his mother and me, I felt the ache in my chest give way to something lighter, a gentle assurance that, in the end, love had reclaimed its place in both our hearts. I rocked the swing gently as the sun dips low, painting the porch in strokes of gold and lavender. My grandson's toy blocks clatter softly on the wooden floorboards as he stacks them into towers of imagination. He pauses and looks up at me with those bright, curious eyes, the same eyes his father once had when he believed the world was boundless. "Grandpa, did you build castles too?" he asks, his voice small and hopeful. I smile, feeling the warmth of his trust settle in my chest. "No, son," I whisper, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "I built something harder." I draw in a breath, counting the moments that have led me here. Nights of silent sacrifice, the weight of unseen tears, the quiet dignity of standing tall when everyone expected me to shrink. "I built character," I tell him, and the word hangs between us like a promise. He leans against me, his little frame fitting comfortably in my arms, and I feel the gentle rise and fall of his breath. In that softness, I understand that the greatest structures in life aren't made of stone or mortar. They're built from choices. To forgive when we're wrong, to speak truth when we're ignored, to love without condition, even when love is not returned. The breeze carries the scent of summer blooms and distant laughter from neighbors passing by. I close my eyes and let the years drift behind me. Rehearsal dinners, where I was a ghost in plain sight, whispers of exclusion that threatened to undo me, the hush of a ballroom after I handed over that check, and the silence that followed, when he didn't call. Then the fragile hope of a letter, 4 simple words that mended what had cracked inside us. Here, with this child who looks at me with unwavering faith, I feel a quiet triumph, not the kind that demands applause, but the kind that fills your soul with a steady glow. It's the triumph of grace in the face of betrayal, of love that endures beyond pride and resentment. It's the knowledge that the highest level a man can reach is not measured by wealth or status, but by the strength of his kindness and the breadth of his forgiveness. I kiss the top of his head and whisper, "That's what matters, my boy." He giggles and goes back to building his blocks, each one a testament to the stories we carry and the lessons we pass on. And as I watch him, I finally feel it. Not revenge, not pride, but profound, unwavering peace. Because in the end, I learned that true power isn't in what you own, it's in the legacy of your heart.